The year was 1971 when U.S. President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, calling illegal drug use public enemy number one. Fast forward to 2014 and the supply and demand for illegal drugs is greater than ever. Everything from crack cocaine to crystal meth, even heroin is being moved from South America and sold on America's streets. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, the U.S. spends $51 billion each year on the war on drugs. Even more staggering, about half of the more than 216,000 inmates in U.S. federal prisons are serving time for drug-related crimes. In a shift in policy, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder has called for the elimination of mandatory minimum sentences for small-time drug dealers, admitting the system is broken and prisons are far too overcrowded.
Widespread incarceration at the federal, state, and local levels is both ineffective and unsustainable. It imposes a significant economic burden, totaling $80 billion in 2010 alone, and it comes with human and moral costs that are impossible to calculate.
Joining us now to talk about this is radio host and political activist Richard Fowler. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Anand.
Since Richard Nixon announced this war on drugs, we have seen black people and Hispanic people being disproportionately targeted by these laws. So what has this achieved? Has it reduced drug abuse, or has it simply just perpetuated racial inequalities?
Well, I think it's just perpetuated racial inequalities, which is why the Attorney General and why the President, and I think there's a lot of Republicans who have said, now is the time to end mandatory minimums and really come up with how we fix our criminal justice system. Because beyond the fact that it's racially, it's horrible for the races, it's also costing Americans billions and billions and billions of dollars. And we could save money here.
Right. What has it done to communities, especially low-income, poor black communities, Hispanic communities?
Well, I think what it's done is it's broken the home. You see a lot of men going to jail for long periods of time, especially during the 1980s and early 1990s with the crack cocaine epidemic. People serving 20, 30-year sentences being taken away from their children. And it's really sort of bolstered up this system where African Americans and Hispanics are disproportionately affected by it, and it affects everything from public education and how educational outcomes, the achievement gap, what happens in the community, housing, jobs. It's one of those, it's a trickle down, and it trickles all the way down. The policies created by Richard Nixon and then followed up by Ronald Reagan have trickled down and caused huge impacts.
Right, and of course, for the people who end up in prison, when they come out, they face further obstacles.
Of course, because sadly, our correction system or our corrections rehabilitation system doesn't either correct or rehabilitate. It actually sort of makes the problem uniquely worse, because when you spend 20 years in jail, you're 20 years in the federal penitentiary, you're used to that life. And when you come out of the federal penitentiary, you can't get a job because you're a convicted felon. That means you can't take care of your family. It means you're stuck either doing a menial job or you're pushed back doing the same thing you were doing that got you in prison in the first place. And then it becomes a revolving door, a perpetuating cycle that harms the children that are involved, that harms the family members that are involved, and ultimately that harms the United States as a whole.
Right, and is the judicial system biased against minority groups? Because shouldn't there be constitutional protections against that?
Well, the judicial system is biased, and a great example is the mandatory minimums that are put in place for crack cocaine, and the lack of those mandatory minimums put in place for regular cocaine, or the fact that, when you look at marijuana offenses, those who go to jail for smoking marijuana or dealing marijuana, and those are the majority of those individuals happen to be Hispanic and African American, when we know, all the statistics tell us that marijuana is also being used in suburbia amongst young whites and other groups.
Actually, it's a good point you make there, because there's a lot of myths about drug use when one looks at the racial breakdown. There is the civil rights lawyer, Michelle Alexander, who's written a book on this particular subject. She cites a study which says white students use cocaine and heroin at 7 times the rate of black students and use crack at 8 times the rate. Yet the popular perception is that it's black youngsters who use these drugs more. I mean, is there a bit of a propaganda war going on here?
Well, I think it's part propaganda, it's part the media, because what you see always is African Americans behind bars, African Americans committing these crimes, African Americans when it comes to drug bust, and Hispanics, and you don't see the white counterparts. Also, you have this, sort of affluenza, right? Because you have these, middle class, upper middle class 1%ers who are committing the same crimes, but they can get the big attorneys, they can get the favors from the judge, and even the fact that you have a private attorney all right, not saying that our public defenders aren't amazing, and I have some great public defender friends, and I know some great public defenders out there, but you have these really big attorneys. You can spend a lot of money on, discovery and depositions and all the legal maneuvering that you're able to get a lesser time. African Americans and Latinos on the lower end, in the working class of this country, don't have those same abilities to get that. So they end up plea bargaining out, getting ridiculously long sentences, and it sort of impacts their family and largely impacts the community.
Right, as we had Eric Holder, the U.S. Attorney General, saying at the outset of this interview that, the problem is economically and morally a travesty in this country. Question is, why is reform taking so long? I mean, President Obama's been in office since 2008.
Sadly, and I hate to say this, but this is really a political game. And I think that there's some odd bedfellows on this one, Anand. I think you have folks like Rand Paul who said, listen, let's get sentencing reform done. You've had Democrats and some Republicans say, let's get this done. Not only can it save us money, but it's just downright wrong. Right, and I think what's happening is you have this sort of moral consciousness of the United States Senate, or the perceived moral consciousness that, we've got to get rid of drugs, this sort of Reagan mentality that still exists in the United States House of Representatives, and thus we can't get a bill through that would decrease mandatory minimums. I think we've seen a start of it. We've seen some changes happen, but I think we need more changes, and we really need to take a magnifying glass at our justice system. And I would tell you, I mean, you look at what's happening now in Washington, and we spend more time talking about Benghazi and the IRS, and now we're talking about Bergdahl, and I would want a select committee from the House of Representatives on how we deal in fixing our justice system and making sure that everybody really gets the blind scales of justice that we advertise in our Constitution.
Right, but the president can do things on his own, can't he?
Yes, and we've seen some of that. And I think one thing we've seen from the president is his increasing of, reviewing clemency hearings and getting more and more. I mean, there's no telling what the president's going to do, but the fact that he's hired more clemency attorneys, he's hired more pardon folks, he's sort of gotten folks to advertise pardons. I wouldn't be surprised if on his last day as president, you see hundreds of people get pardoned for committing small-time non-violent drug offenses.
Right, and the Justice Department has instructed, or rather advised, prosecutors to stay away from what they call low-level offenders, people caught with very small amounts of marijuana or caught smoking it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as we begin to see, and there's clearly everybody, I think a lot of governors are, really, really looking at what happens in Colorado and what happens in Washington, and how does the legalization of marijuana impact the bottom line? Because this is all about bottom line. If it is true that by legalizing marijuana, these states can bring more money in, and beyond that, decrease the amount of money they spend in corrections and the judicial process, then I think it's a win-win for both the consumer and those who choose to use marijuana, as well as the state and the state's budget.
Right. You mentioned strange bedfellows in this. There is bipartisan support in the United States for some kinds of reform. Are you hopeful that there will be reform, given that there is this support now?
Well, I mean, you hope there would be reform. I don't think we're going to get reform in 2014 because it is an election year, and in Washington, everything stops during election years. But I think when we get into in the new Congress, the hope is that we get something through that the president can sign, that both Tea Party folks as well as hardline Democrats can come together. When Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz and Rand Paul agree on something.
These are people on opposite sides.
Complete opposite sides of the spectrum. And I think if we can get them to come to the table and really push for some changes on how we do mandatory minimums and sort of reverse a lot of the war on drug laws that we saw both under the Nixon administration as well as the Reagan administration, we could really see the impacts of that the next day on the African American community, on the Latino community, and I think also on government spending. I think we can decrease government spending or at least shift, right? There's a big problem when you spend $30,000 to $40,000 per inmate and you only spend $17,000 to $20,000 per student, right? We've created a system and a dichotomy where we basically prop up the prison industrial complex and we degrade and try to privatize our education system, and I think there has to be a shift there.
Richard Fowler, let's leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.